The winter storm of 1887 raged across the Kansas plains with a force that seemed bent on swallowing the world whole. Snow swept in thick, wild sheets, stinging the eyes and burying every path beneath a white that did not end. The wind howled like a wolf, with no master, slamming against the walls of the Harper ranch house and rattling the shutters until they threatened to give. Inside, Silas Harper sat by the fire, boots planted firmly on the rug, a wool blanket draped across his shoulders. He had weathered storms before, but this one felt different. Perhaps it was the quiet that pressed in on him, the kind that reminded a man he was the only one left to listen to the sound of his own breath. It had been 3 winters since his wife Abigail and their daughter had been taken by fever, 3 winters since laughter had last lived in these walls. He had grown used to silence, to the echo of his own voice in an empty room. But as the storm clawed at the windows that night, he felt the loneliness gnaw deeper than ever. He told himself it was only the wind when he thought he heard something else, faint but desperate, like a cry carried from far away. He frowned, listening harder, then pushed up from his chair. The fire sputtered low, but he left it behind, pulling on his coat and gloves with steady hands. Out in the yard, the world was nothing but white and shadow. Snow rose nearly to his knees as he trudged toward the barn, lantern held high, the light no more than a weak circle against the storm's fury. He meant to check the horses, to be certain the doors held, but halfway across the yard he stopped. There, crouched against the barn wall, was a figure huddled close to the ground, covered in snow like a heap of forgotten rags. His heart lurched. He moved closer, brushing snow away with the back of his glove, and found not one figure, but 2. A woman, her shawl frozen stiff around her shoulders, and a small boy tucked tightly in her arms. Her lips were pale, her eyes closed, and yet when the lantern's glow touched her face, she stirred faintly. The boy whimpered, a sound so weak it barely carried above the storm. Silas bent down without a thought, lifting them both, one in each arm, their weight no more than bundles of sticks against his broad frame. Back inside the house, the warmth of the hearth wrapped around them, though the woman still shivered violently, her breath shallow. Silas laid her on the settee, then took the boy into his arms, rubbing life back into his small fingers. The boy's eyes fluttered open, wide and gray, fixed on him with a fear that eased only when Silas set him against the heat of the fire. The woman's voice cracked as she finally managed to speak. "Work," she whispered. "I will work, not charity." Her words trembled, but her pride was plain. Silas studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Stay," he said, "at least until the storm passes." And for the first time in years, his house was no longer empty. The storm that had brought May Whitlow and her boy to the Harper Ranch raged for 2 more days before the wind eased and the sky cleared to a pale, cold blue. Snow lay heavy across the land, burying fences and drifts of hay, but inside the house, all was still. Silas Harper moved through his own rooms with the same heavy silence he had carried for years, each step echoing against walls that had grown too familiar with loneliness. The fire burned in the hearth, the smell of smoke clinging to the air, but the house itself felt like a hollow shell. May had taken a corner of the kitchen for herself and Thomas. She kept the boy close, wrapping him in quilts when he grew restless. Her hands always busy, though her eyes carried the look of someone who had known too much hardship. She washed dishes without being asked, mended an old curtain with stitches so fine that Silas paused once in the doorway, surprised by the neatness of her work. She spoke little, only when necessary, but her voice, soft and steady, carried a strength he did not expect. The boy filled the silence in small ways, his questions spilling out as he grew more comfortable near the fire. He asked about the horses in the barn, about the strange ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, about the wide hat Silas wore when he went out into the snow. Silas answered when he felt able, his words short and clipped, but the child never seemed put off. Instead, he followed him with eyes that were bright despite the shadows beneath them. At night, the house grew quieter still. Silas kept to his study, where the ledgers waited, long columns of numbers that gave him something to focus on besides the weight in his chest. He would sit for hours with a pencil in hand, yet sometimes he found himself listening for footsteps that never came. May would be in the kitchen, tidying after the day, her movements careful so as not to disturb him. The boy's laughter, faint as it was, would fade into sleep, and then only silence remained, thick enough that Silas often set his pencil down and closed his eyes, letting the fire fill the room with its restless crackle. It was not lost on him that she refused charity. Each morning she asked what work there was to be done, her chin lifted, though her shoulders sagged with weariness. She swept the floors, scrubbed the pots, even carried wood to the fire until her hands reddened from the cold. Silas did not stop her, though part of him wanted to. Instead he watched, measuring her pride against her need, and wondered if perhaps this house had been waiting for such quiet determination. The ranch outside lay buried, and the road to town was closed by snow. But within those walls life began to stir in ways he had not expected. Still, the silence clung to every corner, reminding him that though he had given them shelter, he had not yet given them a place in his heart. That, he told himself, would remain closed, no matter how the boy's laughter softened the edges of the night, or how the sight of May moving quietly through his home brought warmth to rooms that had long forgotten it. The wind outside had softened to a low moan, the kind that crept along the edges of the roof and slipped under doors like an unwelcome guest. The ranch lay buried in snow, white fields stretching endless under the pale moon. But inside the Harper house, the fire glowed steady in the study. Silas Harper sat slouched in his high-backed chair, eyes closed, his hand resting heavy on the armrest. To anyone passing, he might have looked half asleep, the picture of a weary man dozing after a long day. But he was not asleep. He was listening. He had chosen this night with care, the clock ticking past 10 as he leaned back and slowed his breathing, testing the woman who had come into his home by storm's mercy. He told himself it was only caution. He had built too much, lost too much, to risk being fooled by soft eyes and careful manners. He would know what kind of woman she truly was when she thought him blind to her. The house creaked as it always did, the wind pressing against the windows, the fire crackling low. Then he heard it, faint steps from the hallway, slow and hesitant. The latch turned, and the door eased open with a soft groan. For a long moment, there was nothing, only silence. Then the steps crossed the floor, quiet as breath. He caught the faintest trace of lavender, mixed with the scent of wool still damp from snow. He expected her to move toward his desk, perhaps lift a ledger, or peek into the drawers where he kept contracts and deeds. His jaw tightened, his eyes stayed shut. But instead of drawers opening or papers rustling, there came a smaller sound, a child's whisper. "Mama, is he still sleeping?" Silas's chest tightened, though he kept his face still. May's answer came low, soft enough to almost blend with the fire. "Yes, baby, he is sleeping." The boy sighed, the rustle of fabric telling Silas the child had knelt on the rug not far from his chair. "Is he still sad, Mama?" There was a pause before she answered. "Yes, I think so. Like your papa used to be." The child's voice was quiet but certain. "He gave us firewood and food. Does that mean he is good?" May's reply trembled with care. "Yes, I believe so. A good man can still carry pain." Silas felt the words strike him deeper than he wanted. He waited for them to leave, but instead, May spoke again, her voice trembling as if she carried a weight even in prayer. "Dear Lord, thank you for this roof, for this warmth, and thank you for the man who gave it to us." Thomas echoed her words, his small voice sure and solemn. May added softly, "Please help him remember he is not alone. Help his heart to feel joy again." Silas's throat burned. His fingers curled into the worn leather of the chair. He had expected deceit or greed, but instead had been given a prayer for his broken heart. When their steps faded and the door shut gently behind them, he opened his eyes to the fire's glow. For the first time in many winters, the silence did not feel empty. The nights that followed carried the same steady rhythm, the fire whispering low in the study, the clock marking each hour with a hollow chime, the house settling into its silence. Silas Harper kept to his chair, as he had before. Collar loosened, blanket drawn over his lap, his body still as stone. To anyone who might see him, he looked lost in sleep. But his mind was sharp, his breath measured. He waited, listening for what had begun to feel less like a test and more like a ritual. Somewhere between 10 and 11, the door eased open. Soft steps crossed the rug, light enough to barely stir the air. May moved carefully, always careful, as though she feared disturbing more than just his rest. At first she only lingered near the fire, kneeling to coax the embers back into flame. He would catch the glow of it against his eyelids, feel the shift in the room as warmth spread again. One night he noticed her pause to glance at him, her hand hovering at the iron poker, her eyes holding something like sorrow. She never spoke to him, never broke the fragile veil of his feigned slumber. Yet each act carried words she seemed unwilling to give voice to. On another evening, when the wind rattled the shutters hard enough to shake the glass, he felt the blanket over his chest shift. Her hand, light but certain, pulled it higher across him, tucking it against his shoulders. For an instant her fingers brushed the edge of his shirt, the touch so fleeting he almost thought he had imagined it. His pulse hammered in his ears, but he did not move, afraid the moment would vanish if he so much as stirred. She began leaving small things, tokens of care that spoke louder than words. A warmed stone wrapped in cloth pressed near his feet, so that he would not wake with frozen toes. A mug of broth set quietly on the desk, steam curling upward, though he never lifted it until after she had gone. Once she folded one of Thomas's small quilts over the chair arm, muttering under her breath that men never seemed to think of their own comfort. Silas bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling, his chest tight with something he did not dare name. The boy came sometimes too, his whispering voice a soft echo in the quiet. "Is he still sleeping, Mama?" "Yes, baby, still sleeping." May would guide him back with a firm but gentle hand. Though more than once, Silas felt the boy's gaze on his face, curious and thoughtful. He wanted to open his eyes, to speak, but pride, fear, and a strange kind of shame held him still. Night by night, what had begun as a guard against deceit became something else. He found himself waiting for the sound of the door, for the careful tread of her steps, for the way she mended not just the fire, but the hollow silence that had lived in the house for years. And though he never moved, though his eyes stayed shut, Silas Harper began to breathe differently, no longer only to endure, but to feel. The study had long been the heart of Silas Harper's world, a place of ledgers and receipts, rows of figures that gave him a sense of order when the rest of life had turned to ash. He had spent countless nights bent over the desk, the scratch of his pencil the only sound, as if keeping track of cattle and debts might fill the silence that grief left behind. Yet lately, the numbers blurred before his eyes, lines doubling, ink smudging beneath his hand. His attention drifted, pulled instead toward the memory of quiet footsteps, the faint rustle of fabric, the scent of lavender and smoke that seemed to linger in the corners long after May Whitlow had left. One evening, as the fire burned low and the clock struck 11, she entered as she always did. He kept still, his body heavy against the chair, his breathing slow. She knelt at the hearth, coaxed the flames alive, then moved toward him. The blanket shifted across his chest, tucked with the same gentle care, but this time she did not turn away. He sensed her pause beside the desk, her hand brushing against the worn wood. His heart thudded. She drew something from her apron pocket, a faint crackle of paper filling the stillness. Slowly, carefully, she placed it beside the ledger. Her voice came in a whisper so soft he almost doubted it. "I know you will find this, even if you pretend not to." Her steps retreated, the door shut with its usual quiet click. And once again the room was his alone. For a long while he did not move, his pride battling the pull of curiosity. At last, his eyes opened. The paper lay folded neat and square on the desk, the firelight casting it in a golden glow. With a hand that shook more than he cared to admit, he reached for it, unfolding the creased edges until the words appeared in her careful hand. "Mr. Harper, you may not see it yet, but I believe you are worthy of love again, even if you do not believe it yourself. He stared at the line until it blurred, the letters swimming before his eyes. Something deep inside him, long locked away, cracked open at the edges. He folded the note with slow precision, as if it were glass that might shatter, and slipped it inside the cover of the ledger, tucking it between pages of figures that suddenly seemed small and hollow. His thoughts drifted back unbidden to a summer long ago, sunlight streaming through the window, his wife Abigail leaning down to brush flour from her hands across his brow as she teased him for losing himself in numbers. He had buried that memory beneath stone and silence. Yet tonight it came alive again, carried on the voice of another woman who had dared to see him not as he was, but as he might be. Silas closed the ledger and sat back in his chair. For the first time in years, the fire's warmth reached beyond his skin and into his chest. He did not smile, not fully, but the corners of his mouth curved with the faintest trace of something he had thought gone forever. The morning had begun like any other, the gray light of winter seeping through frost-covered windows, the house cold enough that every breath hung like smoke in the air. Silas Harper rose early, pulling on his coat before the fire had time to warm, his boots striking the floorboards with steady weight. He had meant to check the barn, to see if the storm had weakened the doors, but as he passed through the kitchen, he stopped short. Something in the air felt wrong, heavy, as if the house itself held its breath. May Whitlow was there on the floor, her body curled beside the stove, one hand still clutched around a wooden spoon. Her shawl had slipped from her shoulders, her skin slick with sweat, her lips cracked and pale. For one heart-stopping moment, Silas thought she might already be gone, but then her chest rose faintly, shallow and slow. He was at her side in 2 strides, dropping to his knees, the sound of her ragged breath cutting deeper than the cold ever could. "May," he said, his voice rough, but her eyes only fluttered weakly. "Thomas, the soup," she murmured, her words wandering as fever carried her away. Silas gathered her into his arms, her weight shockingly light, her body burning hot against the chill of his coat. "You should have spoken," he muttered under his breath, his jaw set hard against the surge of fear that rose in him. Carrying her up the staircase, each step groaned beneath his boots, but he did not slow until he reached the guest room, the one that had once belonged to Abigail's sister, when summers still carried laughter into these walls. He laid May gently on the bed, pulled the covers high around her trembling frame, and brushed damp strands of hair from her forehead. Her skin seared his palm. Downstairs, the sound of quick footsteps came, and Lydia appeared in the doorway, her gray hair coiled tight, her eyes sharp behind wire spectacles. "What is it?" she asked. Her voice clipped, then stilled as she took in the sight. "She collapsed," Silas said, his voice firm though his throat burned. "Send for the doctor." Lydia frowned. "At this hour? For a maid?" "She is not just a maid," Silas snapped, louder than he had spoken in months. "She is under this roof, and she will be treated with the same respect as any woman who bears its name." For a moment the housekeeper's eyes narrowed, but she gave a stiff nod and left the room. Silas sat beside the bed, a damp cloth in hand, wiping May's fevered brow. Her lips moved faintly, whispering words that made his chest ache. "Please, do not let Thomas go to the orphan house." His grip tightened around her hand, his own eyes stinging with a heat he had not felt in years. "You are not going anywhere," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Neither of you. You are safe here." For the first time since he had buried his wife and daughter, tears fell from his eyes, hot and unrelenting, as the storm outside clawed against the windows, and the woman before him fought silently for breath. The frost of late winter still clung to the ground when Silas Harper stepped onto the porch one quiet morning and saw a small leather satchel resting near the railing. The ribbon tied around it was frayed, the kind of knot that spoke of hurried hands and a heavy heart. Inside, he knew there would be little, perhaps 2 dresses, a brush, and the wooden horse that Thomas never parted with for long. He stood there for a moment, his breath curling in the cold, the sight of that bag pressing against his chest like a weight he had not expected. May stood a few feet away, her coat drawn tight, her face pale against the winter sky. She did not turn as he came closer. though he knew she had heard the creak of his boots on the boards. "You were just going to leave," he said, his voice low but steady. She froze, then drew a slow breath. "I thought it best," she replied, though her fingers trembled on the strap of her coat. "After what happened, I do not want to be a burden, or worse, a subject of gossip." Silas studied her, the way her chin lifted though her eyes were shadowed with fear. "You are neither," he answered, but she shook her head. "They say things in town," she whispered, "about me, about you, that I came here looking for comfort in a rich man's house, that I use your grief to make a place for myself." Her words faltered, but she forced them through. "I will not have Thomas grow beneath whispers." Silas felt his jaw tighten, his hands curling against the cold railing. "I do not care what they say," he told her, but May's lips pressed thin. "Well, I do," she answered, "because words follow children longer than they follow men." The silence stretched heavy between them, broken only by the groan of the wind across the plain. At last he stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath his boots. "You do not need to earn your place here through endless work," he said quietly, "and you do not need to run because of the tongues of others. You are not beneath this roof as a servant, May. You are beside me. That is different." Her eyes lifted then, gray as storm clouds, and for a moment something unspoken trembled there, but she shook her head again, tears brimming though unshed. "You do not know what you are asking," she whispered. "I gave my trust once and it ruined me. I cannot give it so easily again." She reached for the satchel, but her hand faltered, and Silas saw it, the battle within her. He did not try to stop her, not with his hands, but his voice, rough and quiet, lingered as she turned toward the door. "If you must go, then go. But know this, you are not leaving pity behind. You are leaving a man who has not felt life in years until you stepped into his house." May's fingers tightened on the satchel. She stood still, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Then, slowly, she set the bag back down on the porch boards. She walked inside, the door closing soft behind her, and Silas remained where he was, the winter air biting at his skin, his heart caught between fear and hope. The sky split open with a roar that morning, rain spilling in wild sheets as if the heavens themselves had cracked. For 2 days it had poured without rest, soaking the plains until the earth turned to mud, every trail swallowed beneath rushing water. Silas Harper stood at the edge of the barnyard, coat plastered to his shoulders, his hat long since torn away by the storm. The creek behind the ranch had risen past its banks, churning with a force that carried fences, barrels, and branches like twigs. The air smelled of wet earth and lightning, and the noise of the flood drowned nearly every other sound. One of the ranch hands shouted above the storm, his voice ragged, "The foals are trapped near the south meadow. If the water rises any more, they will be gone." Silas did not hesitate. He mounted the nearest gelding and spurred it hard, the animal's hooves throwing mud as they cut across the pasture. Rain stung his face like needles, the ground shaking beneath the rush of water. He reached the meadow and found them, 3 young horses pressed against a line of trees, their eyes wide with terror as the current swirled at their hooves. The rope fence meant to hold them had snapped, tangled pieces floating away in the torrent. Silas swung down, mud swallowing his boots to the ankle, and began tying new lines to the thick oak trunks, pushing the foals back toward higher ground. His hands worked quick but steady, muscles straining against the pull of frightened animals and the surge of water. He gritted his teeth, forcing the rope into place, but the roar of the storm swallowed every sound of comfort he tried to give. Then he saw her. May stumbled into view at the far edge of the meadow, skirt soaked, hair undone, beneath a sagging hood. Thomas was clutched tight against her chest, his small face buried in the shawl. Silas's heart dropped to his boots. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice raw against the storm. "You are out of your mind." "The hill path collapsed," she cried back, her words nearly torn away by the wind. "I had no choice but to cut through the riverbed." Thomas stirred, whimpering, and she tightened her hold around him. "Go to the storm shelter," Silas bellowed. "I will not leave you." But the ground gave way beneath her feet, one knee sinking deep into the rushing water. Silas's chest burned as he tied the last knot, forcing the folds back, then ran hard toward her. She scrambled up again. Thomas held high, her eyes locking on him with a fierce steadiness. "I am fine," she yelled, though her voice trembled. He reached her side, grasped her arm, and dragged her toward the east shed, the only structure left standing against the flood. He kicked the door open and pulled her inside, slamming the latch against the raging wind. His knees buckled, his breath ragged, water streaming from his coat and hair. May crouched near the wall, Thomas shivering in her arms, both of them alive by a thread. Silas dropped beside them, his hands shaking as he pulled them close, burying his face in her wet hair. "You could have died," he said, his voice breaking. "You both could have died." May's chest heaved, but she said nothing, her silence filled with all the fear she had tried to hide. He tightened his arms around her and the boy, his words raw and certain. "You are my family, May. Do you hear me? Without you, I have nothing left." Her eyes widened, tears spilling despite the storm still raging outside. Thomas stirred in her lap, whispering, "Mama, is Mr. Harper crying?" She brushed his damp hair back and nodded softly. "Yes, darling, I believe he is." Silas let out a broken laugh through his tears, held them tighter, and closed his eyes as the flood roared past, carrying away fences and barns, but not what mattered most. The storm passed at last, leaving the land scarred and broken. Fences washed away, fields covered in silt, and barns half torn from their foundations. The Harper Ranch stood, though battered, and the people within it endured. Silas and his men worked from dawn until nightfall, hauling timber, setting new posts, and clearing the mud. May moved through the house with quiet strength, caring for Thomas and preparing food for those who labored. Yet beneath every chore, there lingered a tension that grew heavier with each day. It was not the storm that threatened them now, but the voices that carried beyond the ranch, whispers that traveled faster than any flood. May heard them first in town when she ventured to the market. She had gone for flour and beans, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, but the moment she stepped inside, the chatter slowed. Women who had once nodded politely now covered their mouths, speaking behind gloved hands. At the bakery, the conversation stopped entirely when she entered, and she felt the weight of eyes on her back as she counted out her coins. By the time she returned to the ranch, her cheeks were pale, her steps quick with shame she did not deserve. Silas noticed the change. He saw it in the way she kept her gaze lowered, in the silence that followed her when she thought no one was listening. He caught it in the sharp glances of men in town, in the forced cheer of Mr. Hensley at the bank, in the way Lydia set his plate before him each morning without lifting her eyes. The words had spread. They said Silas Harper had taken in a widow, not out of mercy, but out of weakness, that he had been bewitched, that grief had clouded his judgment and left him soft. At the center of it stood Everett Parker, a man with smooth words and a bitter heart. Months before May ever stepped foot on Harper land, he had offered her safety in exchange for obedience. She had refused, and he had not forgotten the slight. Now he spoke freely in the saloon and at the store, telling anyone who would listen that she had used her sorrow to trap a grieving man, that she had once been his to claim, and that only pity and loneliness had bound her to the Harper house. One evening May sat on the back porch, her shawl clutched tightly around her, her hands knotted in the fabric, as if it might hold her steady. The sky stretched wide and lavender above the hills, but her eyes were fixed on the ground. Silas joined her, his boots heavy on the worn planks. For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the last calls of meadowlarks. At last she spoke, her voice quiet but raw. "They are saying I bewitched you, that I used your grief to climb where I had no right." Silas turned to her, his gaze steady. "Let them say it. Words are not truth." But she shook her head, her lips trembling. "It is not just words. It hurts, even if I know it is not true." Her eyes lifted to his, gray with pain. "I never came here to steal anything, Silas. I came only to survive." He reached for her hands, rough calluses brushing soft scars, and held them firmly. "I cannot replace the man you lost, May, and you cannot replace the ones I buried. But I can be the man who stays." She swallowed hard, her shoulders trembling as tears threatened. But for the first time since she had heard the whispers, she did not turn away. Spring crept slowly across the Kansas plains, as if unsure whether to stay or retreat back into the arms of winter. Snow melted into soft mud, streams filled with clear running water, and the cottonwoods whispered with the first green of the season. At the Harper Ranch, the damage of the floods still showed in broken fences and washed-out trails. Yet each day brought small signs of life returning. Calves stumbled on unsteady legs in the pastures, and birds built nests under the eaves of the barn. Silas Harper moved among it all with sleeves rolled, his hands rough with work, but his heart carried a new weight, one that had nothing to do with timber or cattle. On a quiet morning, he walked with May to the hill that rose behind the house. The ground was still damp, the air cool, but the sun shone bright enough to bring warmth to their shoulders. There, near the graves of Abigail and the little girl they had lost, a young plum tree stood. Silas had planted it weeks before, when the ground was still hard with frost, his fingers stiff from the cold. Now small buds swelled along its thin branches, a promise of blossoms to come. May paused before it, her hand brushing the bark, as though she feared it might break. "Why here?" she asked softly, her voice unsteady. Silas looked at the tree, his jaw set, then let his gaze drift to the markers in the earth, weathered by years of wind and storm. "Because life should rise where sorrow once lay," he answered. "Because we cannot let the ground hold only grief." She said nothing at first, only stood with her eyes lowered, the shawl tight across her shoulders. He watched her, the way the wind stirred loose strands of her hair, the way her chin trembled, though she tried to hide it. Finally she spoke, her words hushed but strong. "I do not know if I am brave enough to begin again. I have lost too much." Silas stepped closer, his hand hovering before he let it rest gently over hers on the bark. "Neither of us can replace what was taken, May. We cannot fill the silence left behind. But perhaps we can keep it from swallowing us whole." She lifted her eyes to him, gray as storm clouds, and for a moment the air between them carried every unspoken truth. The days that followed were filled with labor. Together they mended fences, hauled wood, and coaxed the garden into life again. Thomas followed them everywhere, carrying small stones in his pockets, his laughter a lantern that brightened even the hardest tasks. May's hands grew rough with work, yet Silas noticed how she lingered by the tree each evening, how her lips moved in silent words he never asked her to speak aloud. One night, as the sun set behind the hills, Silas joined her beneath its branches. The sky glowed with the last fire of the day, and the tree stood straight and sure against it. He took her hand, pressing it against his chest. "This tree will grow," he said quietly, "and so will we, if you will let it." She blinked back tears, her lips trembling, but she nodded. And in that small motion, a promise was born, not carved in stone, but planted like roots deep in the soil, strong enough to weather every storm still to come. Spring settled soft over Kansas, the kind of spring that felt almost shy, as though it had been gone so long it did not know if it was welcome. The plains, once scarred by flood and frost, stretched wide in green once more, the air alive with the hum of bees and the sweet song of meadowlarks. At the Harper Ranch, there was laughter now, laughter where silence had once ruled. And in the yard, Thomas chased a wooden horse across the grass, his voice rising high with delight. Inside the house, May stood before a small mirror, her pale blue dress smoothed beneath her hands, her hair swept up with pins borrowed from Lydia. Her heart beat fast, not with fear this time, but with something she had almost forgotten how to name. There was no preacher from the city, no curious crowd gathered to watch. Instead, they had chosen a circle of cottonwoods on the hill, where the earth was soft, with new grass, and the plum tree bloomed beside the graves of those Silas had lost. It was there that the vows would be spoken, and it was there that life would begin again, not to erase what had come before, but to honor it with something new. Silas waited at the tree, his broad shoulders squared, his coat brushed clean, though still smelling faintly of leather and rain. His hands, scarred from work, gripped a simple band of gold he had carried in his pocket for weeks, waiting for this day. When May stepped into view, The breath caught in his chest. The blue of her dress matched the sky above, her eyes shining brighter than he had ever seen them. Thomas walked proudly between them, his vest far too big, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself. He insisted he was both ring-bearer and best man, and no one had argued. The words spoken were plain and true. Silas promised to stand, to stay, to make his house her home and his heart her shelter. May promised not to erase what could not be erased, but to walk beside him through whatever storms still lay ahead. Thomas tugged her hand when her voice trembled, and she laughed through her tears as she finished her vow. When Silas leaned down and kissed her beneath the branches, the plum blossoms fell like snow, soft against their shoulders, carrying the scent of promise. They stood together, three souls bound not by fortune or fairy tale, but by survival, by trust, hard-earned, and by the simple courage to try again. Silas bent and lifted Thomas high, the boy laughing as petals rained around them. "Mama looks like an angel," Thomas whispered, his small arms wrapped around Silas's neck. May smiled, her tears glistening, and Silas kissed her forehead, his voice low and sure. "That is the first time I have seen your smile belong to the future." If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to Western Love Legends for more tales of courage and love. Leave a like to let us know you are with us, and share a comment about what part stayed with you most. Stories like these grow stronger when they are carried together. And who knows, maybe next time, Thomas will demand to be not just best man, but the one giving the vows himself.